One night, he ends up being murdered, and the school tries to cover it up as an accident, being like, oh, he slipped on his microscope and it cut his throat. But obviously, his throat was slit by someone and he was murdered. And basically the goal of this story, right, is showing us how like, oh, the Wicked Witch wasn't actually as wicked as people made her out to be, right? And yet that right there, that sounds like some Wicked Witch stuff to me. Like, that's so messed up. But it also seems out of character because throughout this whole story, Elphaba has been fighting for animal rights, and yet here she is performing gruesome surgeries on these poor monkeys. Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Wicked by Gregory Maguire, published in 1995, the full title being Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West. And I'm comparing it with the new movie, released in 2024, directed by John M. Chu. And this movie is less an adaptation of the book and more just the movie version of the Broadway musical, which was an adaptation of the book. So it went, the book, the musical, and now this movie. But the musical, the storyline was written by Winnie Holzman, and the music and lyrics were written by Stephen Schwartz. And I recently did a book versus movie comparing the original Wizard of Oz from 1900 with the 1930s book. And if you have not yet watched that video, you definitely should. After you finish this one, I will link to it. But yeah, a lot of things from both that book and movie come into play here in Wicked. And so I'm really glad I read and watched that prior to Wicked. But before I talk about Dorothy and Glinda and Elphaba, I first need to talk about Ana Luisa. And no, Ana Luisa isn't a witch in The Wizard of Oz. Ana Luisa is an incredible jewelry company that is sponsoring today's video. So these earrings I am wearing are Ana Luisa. One is a star, the other is a moon. And then also this 2-in-1 necklace I have on, which I love. 2-in-1 necklaces. Like, I love the layering. It looks so cool. So this one is also Ana Luisa. And they currently have a huge sale going on. So now is the time to buy something from them. And let's be honest, if Glinda had access to Ana Luisa jewelry, she would have been wearing it constantly. And when she tries to give Elphaba a makeover to get her to be popular, she would have been encouraging Elphaba to also wear Ana Luisa. And they have such an amazing range of pieces of jewelry too, from pieces that go with more casual outfits all the way up to things that are very fancy. And yet, even though these are so high quality and made to last and they look beautiful, they are very reasonably priced. And then add the sale they have going on top of that, and it is even more reasonably priced, of course. So products are up to 35% off. Right now, it is the biggest sale of the year, and items go fast when they have this sale going on. So you should definitely use my link down below in the description. Take advantage of this sale while supplies last and buy something for yourself or for someone else. I know I personally am going to take advantage of this, and I'm going to buy myself some earrings I've had my eye on. And then I'll also probably get something for one of my sisters because it's the holidays and it feels selfish to only get something for myself. So yeah, whether you want some jewelry for yourself or a loved one, use my link down below and get something at 35% off while you still can. And I've been a fan of Ana Luisa before I started partnering with them. So I am being sincere when I say that I love their jewelry and I would highly recommend it. So yeah, again, use that link down below. It is an affiliate link too. So if you buy something using that link in particular, it does benefit me, which I greatly appreciate, and it helps support the channel and keep Why the Book Wins going. And now to get back into Wicked. So to begin with my spoiler-free thoughts, I want to start out by saying that I never saw this musical live. So this was my first time experiencing this, and I loved the movie so much. I loved every minute of it. And I'm so excited now for part 2. And initially when I heard they were splitting it into 2 parts, I was kind of annoyed that they weren't just doing one movie. And yet now that I've seen part 1, I can't imagine how they would have condensed it down into like an hour and 15 minutes in order to make room for the second half of the story, because this movie, it's 2.5 hours, and yet I was fully enthralled the entire time. I was never bored. I was so captivated and invested in the story. And then, of course, the music is incredible, and the cast is just perfect. And all the way around, this is just a visually stunning movie, and I do think it was also an improvement on the story within the book. Speaking of the book, I had heard that this was just like an insane story that was very dark, and it was just like a wild ride of a book. And so I was very curious and excited to read it. And while yes, it is pretty insane at times, ultimately I was not invested in this story, and I had a hard time caring about anything. And even like the crazy events weren't even enough to make me care and want to keep reading. I just thought it went on for far too long at times. And then it also leans heavily into the fantasy aspect of the story. And I personally just don't like reading fantasy. So that is a personal preference right there. So just like all of the world building and the politics going on within this magical world, I just didn't care. Which is funny because I loved the original book, The Wizard of Oz. And I guess that's considered fantasy, I suppose. But it's also a children's book. And so it's not like this complex world building going on. It's very simple and straightforward, despite being, this like silly, crazy fantasy story of sorts. And so yeah, Wicked, it was just a bit too complex on the fantasy side for my taste. But I would love to hear from fantasy readers who have read this book, because I would think if you're a fan of fantasy, then maybe you would have enjoyed this. But I did think this was such a cool premise for a book and just such a cool idea. And so I really wanted to like it. And yet ultimately, along with the fantasy aspect, I also just didn't care about these characters. So I feel like they weren't written in the best way because I was just not invested. And ultimately, throughout most of this, I just felt apathetic. And apathetic is just about the worst thing a book or a movie can make you feel. And honestly, if it wasn't for me wanting to make this video, I probably would have stopped halfway. But I made it through and I read the whole thing. And I will say this book is broken up into 5 parts. And I will say that part 5 got more interesting. So that was probably my favorite section of the book, was the very last section. So at least it picked up near the end, I guess, right? But yeah, with this movie, like I said, it is part 1, so it stops at the halfway point. But I've read the whole book, and I also went online to read what the Broadway play was like, just to see how similar it was to the movie. And so I have read how the play ends. However, for those who do not want spoilers for part 2, do not worry, because I won't mention anything that we don't see in this movie until the very end. So after I do my book versus movie section, which I feel like you can probably tell which one I'm going to say wins in the end. But after that section, I will then have a section talking about the events in the second half of the book and how it compares to the second half of the musical based on what I've read. So if you don't want to hear that, then after my book versus movie section, you can just click away and avoid spoilers. But now let's move on to the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers going forward for the first half of the book and for the first movie, part 1, Wicked. So beginning with Elphaba and her family in the book specifically. So in the book, Elphaba's father, he's like a priest or minister, some sort of religious figure. And he is gone a lot of the time out preaching and doing his thing, and he is married. And while he is gone, his wife is just bored and lonely. And so she is getting drunk/high on the fantasy world equivalent of drugs and alcohol. And she also will take in passerbyers as they, are going through town. And she ends up being pregnant with Elphaba, but she does not know who the father is because so much of that time, it's just a haze for her because she was under the influence of these different things. But when Elphaba is born, she is green and she has really sharp teeth and bites everything. Like they even have to cover her hands, otherwise she would be chewing her hands off. However, as she gets older, the biting gets under control and she stops doing that. However, her skin, of course, stays green. And it's funny because this is obviously a fantasy world where anything could happen. There's all sorts of strange creatures. And yet her being green is so unusual and is such a big deal. So despite this being such an insane fantasy world where anything is possible, the fact that she is green, people just can't get over that. And they think it's so strange. And Elphaba gets a lot of negative attention because of it. And a few years pass and a guy from Quadling country, he's passing through town and he ends up just staying and living with them for quite some time. And again, the husband is still frequently gone. And so the mother has an affair with this guy and she becomes pregnant yet again. And they have a nanny who is living with them. And the nanny wants to help her not have another green baby. And so she got some drugs from this old crone that she is told will help prevent the child from being green. And this crone also could see into the future, and she saw that Elphaba and her future sister were going to play an important role in the world of Oz. However, the nanny doesn't tell the mom that. She just tells her like, hey, like I have this drug, and if you take it every day until the birth, your child won't be green. And so she does this. However, when the child is born, she is not green. However, she has no arms. And she is named Nessrose. And then later on, a few years later, the mother is pregnant yet again, and she gives birth to a boy named Shell. However, in childbirth, the mother dies. To move on to the movie with Elphaba and her parents. So the father here, he is not a religious figure. He is a political figure. But we see once again that the mother had an affair, and that led to the birth of Elphaba. However, the mother was not in this depressed drugged stupor. She was, fully aware of what she was doing, it seems. And so she gives birth to Elphaba, and they do not have the biting, but they do, of course, have her skin be green. And then the mother has a second child, Nessrose. However, here it is the father who has the mother eat like these type of flowers in order to prevent the child from having green skin. However, in the movie, the flowers cause Nessrose, they cause her legs to be messed up, and so then she is in a wheelchair. And the mother also dies while giving birth to Nessrose because the movie has no shell. And also in the movie, we see starting at a young age that Elphaba has these like telekinetic powers, and it comes out when she has heightened emotion, like it just happens out of her control. And I just recently read and watched Carrie, and so this was definitely giving me Carrie vibes because each of them have a girl who is bullied at school and she has these telekinetic powers that just take over. And then also in Wicked, eventually the witch has water poured on her, a bucket of water, whereas Carrie, she has a bucket of blood fall on her. Just obviously Carrie is fresh in my mind, but I did think those similarities were kind of interesting. So yeah, in the movie, her powers are a huge part of the story, whereas in the book, she kind of has powers, like the ability to do things at times. However, it's kind of random and it just happens here and there, and it isn't a huge focus of the story. And now to move on to Shiz University. So specifically in the book, Elphaba is attending Shiz University and she ends up becoming roommates with Galinda. And this happens because, I guess because they have dorms, there's like the dorm mother, kind of the woman who looks after the girls, the students. And so I guess Galinda, her nanny named Amma Clutch, she is going to be one of these people. However, she shows up late to like the checking in. And so she isn't there to speak on Galinda's behalf. And so Galinda is stuck being roommates with Elphaba. And Galinda also makes it seem like, oh, I can't live with a ton of girls because Amma Clutch, she has a disease where sometimes she talks to inanimate objects as if they are people, and she ignores people and treats them like they're inanimate objects. So she can't be held responsible for a large group of girls. However, this is a lie. She just makes this up in order to help her get a better living situation, although ultimately she ends up being roomed with Elphaba, who is an outcast, not only because of her skin color, but also because she is very headstrong. And so the two of them do not get along. However, one night Galinda is bored, and so she ends up talking to Elphaba, and the two begin to connect. And she gives Elphaba a hat, and when Elphaba puts it on, Galinda is shocked to see that Elphaba is actually beautiful, and she says this to her. And so the two connect this evening. However, the next day in class, when Elphaba tries to talk to Galinda, Galinda is very concerned with being popular, and so she doesn't like that Elphaba is talking to her in public, and she kind of tries to be dismissive to Elphaba so that her friends don't think that she's friends with Elphaba. And then there is a talking goat professor named Professor Dillamond, and Elphaba in the book, she is helping him do research in order to prove that talking animals are like the same as humans in order to get their rights back. Because, by the way, at this point in time, talking animals are being oppressed and their rights are being taken away. And so she is trying to help Professor Dillamond stand up for talking animals. And even Madame Morrible, who is headmistress here in the book, there is a point where she is reading some poetry she wrote, and she ends the poetry by saying, "Animals should be seen, not heard." And this, of course, stirs up a lot of controversy, and the animal professors all like leave because they're upset. And then again, it just starts a lot of drama within the school about animal rights. And by the way, in the movie, they do not have Madame Morrible saying that poem that ends with "animals should be seen, not heard." Instead, during a lesson that the professor is giving, he turns the chalkboard and someone has written "animals should be seen, not heard" on the chalkboard. And then we have a guy named Boq, who is a Munchkinlander who becomes friends with Elphaba as a way to get close to Galinda because he is obsessed with Galinda. And so he starts talking to Elphaba, since that's her roommate, and he ends up helping Elphaba with this animal research she is doing alongside Professor Dillamond. And then later on, Nessrose starts attending Shiz University as well, and they bring the nanny with her because Nessrose, she has no arms, and so the nanny has to stay with her to care for her. And remember, the father was a religious man in the book, and Nessrose too. She is his favorite, and she is also very religious and very pious. And over time, eventually a friend group forms between Nessrose, Elphaba, Boq, Galinda eventually becomes openly friends with them, as well as a guy named Fiyero, who is a prince who is attending the university. But then, amongst all of this tension going on within animal rights at Shiz University, one night, Dr. Dillamond ends up being murdered. And the school tries to cover it up as an accident, being like, oh, he slipped on his microscope and it cut his throat. But obviously, his throat was slit by someone and he was murdered. And Amma Clutch sees something happen, and so she had left to go down and see what happened, but then she's gone for a while, and when she returns, she has the made-up disease that Galinda talked about, where she talks to inanimate objects as if they are people. And Galinda is like, what? Like, I made that up when I was talking to Madame Morrible, and now she actually has this disease. But because she doesn't talk to people as if they are real people, they can't get her to tell them what she saw that night. But as some time goes on, we find out that Madame Morrible was behind the murder of Professor Dillamond, and Amma Clutch also eventually dies. And the night of her funeral, this clique group of friends, they decide they want to go to the philosophy club. And you might think, like, oh, this takes place at a college. These are college students. The philosophy club is probably a place where they go to have very deep philosophical discussions, right? And I don't blame you for thinking that, but you would be wrong. The philosophy club is actually this weird sex club that they go to. And so they go there this night, and we get an extended scene of them at this club that later does not come into play at all. So I don't know why we had to spend so much time in the philosophy club, but we did. Elphaba and Galinda, though, however, do not go to the philosophy club because they instead want to go see the Wizard of Oz in order to give them the research that Professor Dillamond was doing and to tell him about the murder. And also, by the way, Galinda, after the death of Professor Dillamond, she starts going by Glinda instead. Oh, and then another important thing that happens, the day of the funeral, I think it's the same day, Morrible, she gets Elphaba, Nessa, and Glinda together in her office, and she kind of hypnotizes them, and she lays out their future, being like, each of you will be in charge of a different section of this country because each of you has different skills and talents that make you well suited to leadership. And so she sort of hypnotizes them into thinking like, you'll be in charge of this part of the country, you'll be in charge of this part, and you will work alongside the wizard and I. And then when they leave this meeting, because they were under the spell, their memory of this event is very hazy, but of course it is there in the back of their minds, impacting their actions. And now, to get back to the movie, been talking about the book quite a bit, but to get to the movie and Shiz University. So in the movie, Nessrose is the one attending Shiz University. But again, she is the father's favorite, and he is very worried about her, so he tells Elphaba, like, just go and stay with her for a little bit and make sure she's okay. But then there is some drama when Elphaba gets stressed out, and her powers get the best of her, and she causes like some levitation and destruction to go on within this main area where all these students are. And Madame Morrible, a renowned sorceress, she sees this and she covers for Elphaba, telling people it was her, Madame Morrible, who just did that. And she tells Elphaba that she needs to be attending Shiz University herself, and Madame Morrible is also going to give her private lessons to work on this natural talent she has. And Galinda is here and she sees all of this, and she wants badly to be a sorceress, and she is jealous that Elphaba is getting so much attention by Madame Morrible. And while Madame Morrible is with Elphaba, Galinda walks up to say something to Madame Morrible right when Morrible is asking who can room with Elphaba. And Morrible takes this as Galinda volunteering to be roommates with Elphaba, and so in the movie that is how the two of them become roommates. But once again, they do not get along and are at odds for quite some time. And also, I did want to say, kind of interesting, but in the movie, Galinda knows, like, I want to be a sorceress. Whereas in the book, Galinda did not know what she wanted to major in, and it is Madame Morrible who tells her, like, you should major in sorcery. And the reason she tells her this, she's like, you know what, you don't like being roommates with Elphaba? Well, Elphaba is majoring in something else, like life sciences, I think. And so she's telling her, like, if you major in sorcery, which is something different than Elphaba, next year you won't have to be roommates with her. And so that is what leads Galinda to major in sorcery in the book. But then Fiyero shows up, and he makes quite a scene as a bad boy prince who all the girls swoon over. And again, Fiyero was in the book, but he wasn't this bad boy who'd been kicked out of so many schools, and, you know, he's getting them to rebel, and he wasn't this handsome guy like he is in the movie. He was just kind of like a normal student. And yes, he was a prince, but he was already like betrothed to someone else, so he wasn't even an option for them to be dating. But anyway, in the movie, he is a bad boy prince who, again, all the girls swoon over, and he convinces them to go to a nearby club and party, even though it is off limits technically. And thank goodness the movie did not go the philosophy club route with this, and instead, this club he mentions is just a place to dance and have fun. There are no weird public sex acts going on here in the movie. But before they go out to this club, Glenda has given Elphaba a hat, but she does this as a mean joke because she thinks the hat is ugly. However, Elphaba seems truly touched by this gesture, and so she goes to see Madame Morrible and requests that Madame Morrible begin teaching Glenda as well as Elphaba. And then from here, they are all at that club and they are dancing, and Elphaba walks in and she has a moment where they are all laughing at her in her hat. But then Glenda, she has a change of heart, and after this like public display of solidarity where they dance together, the two become friends from here on out. And unlike the book, like I said, she and Elphaba connect, but then after that, when they're in public, Glenda is like, oh, stay away from me. I only talk to you in private. In the movie, that's not the case. We're here after they connect on the dance floor. From here on out, they are publicly known to be friends. And then Glenda and Fihiro, they become a couple, and Glenda is just head over heels for Fihiro. And soon after all of this event takes place, they then go to class, and Professor Dillamond is taken away because they are told that animals can no longer teach at this school. And so he is taken away, and a new professor is brought in, and he has a lion cub in a cage. And he is saying how like, oh, this is how we're going to do things from now on. We're going to keep animals in cages. That way they won't be able to speak. However, Elphaba is very upset about all of this, and she causes all of the fellow students to fall asleep aside from Fihiro. And she and Fihiro go take the cub out of the cage, and they take it out into the forest to rescue it. And the two of them also have this chemistry, and there's clearly a spark there. However, Elphaba knows that nothing can come of this because he is with Glenda. And as in the book, once Dillamond is taken away, he isn't murdered, he's just taken away. Again, Glenda changes her name to Glenda. And by the way, there is a lion cub scene in the book as well. And in the book, so the professor brings in a lion cub and he's like talking about like, oh, who can guess? Can this lion cub talk or not? And then he's going on about wanting to do experiments in the class on the lion cub. And it seems like he already has done some experiments on it, but he's like wanting to do surgical experiments. And all of the students are outraged by this, and they're like yelling at the professor, telling him how horrible that is. And two other students run up and they take the lion cub and they rescue it. So it is not like in the movie where Elphaba and Fihiro rescue the cub. Instead, it's these other two random students. And also in the book, Fihiro, again, he is there at Shiz University and he is part of this friend group. However, he isn't a major character while they are attending Shiz. And he does not date Glenda. Again, he was betrothed to be married to someone else. And he and Elphaba do not have any kind of romance while they are attending Shiz. And now to return to the book again. So I left off saying that Elphaba and Glenda were going to the Emerald City to see the Wizard of Oz. And so they do meet with him and they tell him about the atrocities that are happening to talking animals. And she gives him the research she had been helping Professor Dillamond do. And she also tells him that he has been murdered and yet no one is doing anything about it. And the wizard appears as like bones with light. They never actually see the true wizard at this point. But yeah, when she tells him about Professor Dillamond and all of this animal stuff, the wizard says, I know of Dr. Dillamond and I know of his work, said the glowing bones of the wizard, snorting. Derivative, unauthenticated, specious garbage. What do you expect from an academic animal? Predicated on shaky political notions, empiricism, quackery, tomfoolery, cant, rant, and rhetoric. Were you taken in perhaps by his enthusiasm, his animal passion? The skeleton danced a jig, or perhaps it was a twitch of disgust. I know of his interests and his findings. I know little of what you call his murder, and I care less. So yeah, the meeting does not go as planned. And from here, Glenda and Elphaba part ways, and they part on good terms. But Glenda, she's going to go back to Shiz, whereas Elphaba, she is going to stay in Emerald City, and she ends up becoming part of this underground resistance with the goal of taking down the wizard. Whereas in the movie, so again, Elphaba, she has these special powers, and so Madame Morrible has been writing the wizard about her. And so because of this, she is granted a visit to the wizard, which is a very big deal. And Glenda comes along, and when the two see him, he starts out being all showy. However, when he realizes she is who Morrible wrote him about, he comes out from behind the curtain, and things are going great. And when he asks what Elphaba's desire is, rather than saying she wants her skin color changed, which is what she had been planning on saying all along, instead, she tells him that she wants the animals to be respected again and to help get their rights back. And Oz agrees to this, and then he and Morrible, Madame Morrible has shown up at this point, they show Elphaba the Grimoire, an ancient book of spells that very few can read. However, Elphaba, she can read it right away. And Oz, he gives her the impression that his monkey guards would like to be able to fly. And so Elphaba then reads a spell that gives all of the monkey guards wings. However, this pains them, and Elphaba, regrets what she has done and she wants to undo it. However, it is impossible to undo a spell that was cast by the Grimoire. And then from here, it is revealed that the wizard and Madame Morrible have evil intentions, and they want the talking animals removed from public, and they wanted the monkeys to have wings. That way they could easily fly around and survey the country. And she also learns that the wizard has no powers at all, right? And Madame Morrible, she has powers, but Elphaba is so much more powerful. And so Madame Morrible and the wizard wanted to use Elphaba to cast their spells for them. However, when Elphaba learns all of this, of course, her dreams are shattered when she realizes the truth. And so she tries to escape with Glinda. However, the two are unable to make it out of the building, and Elphaba tries to cast a spell to give herself wings, I guess, but instead what happens is she makes a broom have the ability to fly. And so once again, she and Glinda part ways. However, they part on good terms, and they're very sad to see each other part ways. And Elphaba uses her broom to fly away. And also, meanwhile, while they were trying to escape, the wizard and Madame Morrible were telling the public on the radio, as well as the people of Emerald City, that Elphaba was like an enemy to the country and that she is wicked. And then to address some things that are shown here in the movie and to address how they happen in the book instead. So for one, right there, we saw how the monkeys get their wings, right? But that was not how it happened in the book. In the book, so Elphaba adopts a snow monkey partway through the story, and she tries to teach it how to talk. And then later on, apparently she just has a lot of snow monkeys at this point, and near the end of the book, we learn that she is sewing wings onto them, and we read, "The witch was deep in an operation of sorts, stitching the wings of a white-crested male rock onto the back muscles of one of her current crop of snow monkeys. She had more or less perfected the procedure after years of botched and hideous failures when mercy killing seemed the only fair thing to do for the suffering subject. Fahiro's old school books in the life sciences from Dr. Nicodick's course had given some leads. Also, the Grimoire had helped, if she was reading it correctly. She had found spells to convince the axial nerves to think skyward instead of treeward. And once she got it right, the winged monkey seemed happy enough with their lot. She had yet to see a female monkey in her population produce a winged monkey, but she still had hopes." And basically the goal of this story, right, is showing us how the Wicked Witch wasn't actually as wicked as people made her out to be, right? And yet that right there, that sounds like some Wicked Witch stuff to me. That's so messed up. But it also seems out of character because throughout this whole story, Elphaba has been fighting for animal rights, and yet here she is performing gruesome surgeries on these poor monkeys. Granted, they weren't talking monkeys, so I guess she only cared about the rights of talking animals, not regular animals, but we see her trying to teach it how to talk. So yeah, anyway, that was pretty disturbing and unexpected. And also the Grimoire is something from the book as well. And again, it's this ancient book of spells that is hard to understand, hard to read. However, this is something that she finds at Fahiro's house in the second half of the story when she goes there. And Fahiro's wife tells her that the person who brought the book was a man who had a long fringy white and gray beard and a very kind and abstracted manner, and he smelled of garlic and sour cream. But this guy brings them this book of magic, and he tells them that this book is proof that there are other worlds outside of theirs and that these other worlds can leak into each other, which we know to be true, right? Because the wizard, he came in from another world, as did Dorothy. But yeah, so the Grimoire is a thing, but the movie definitely made it a bigger deal, right? Because it's something the wizard has, and it's far more important, it seems, in the movie than it had been in the book. And near the end of the book, we do learn that Madame Morrible had been in cahoots with the wizard, and the two of them would work on their dastardly deeds together. However, we also see pretty early on that Madame Morrible isn't a great person, right? She's the one who we find out killed Professor Dillamon, for example, right? Well, she didn't do it, but she was behind his murder. Whereas in the movie, it seems like Madame Morrible is a good person right up until the very end. And that is when it is revealed that she is actually evil, right? And she has all of these ulterior motives. And so yeah, basically the movie makes you think she's a good person for longer, whereas in the book, I feel like it was made pretty clear early on that Madame Morrible was horrible. And then I need to talk about Boq and Nessrose because I mentioned him in the book, how he was in love with Galinda and he becomes friends with Elphaba as a way to get closer to Galinda. Whereas in the movie, Boq, he asks Nessa out when Galinda encourages him to do so. And he is in love with Galinda. However, he tries to be happy with Nessa while harboring this crush on Galinda because Galinda's with Fahiro, right? So he's just like, well, I guess I'll make do with Nessa, essentially. And that was not the case in the book. He never dates Nessrose. And also in the book, he has a crush on Galinda. However, after the death of Professor Dillamond, Galinda changes and she becomes a bit more solemn. And so that sort of lessens the crush he has on her. But yeah, in the book, he never dates Nessrose. And also in the book, later on, he ends up marrying some other woman. And the two of them even end up housing Dorothy for a night as Dorothy is making her way through the country later on in the story. But when it comes to book versus movie, obviously the movie wins as far as I am concerned. Again, I loved every minute of it. I laughed, I got teary, I cared about the characters in a way I hadn't cared about them in the book. And again, I didn't dislike the book for being dark and weird, because usually I'm into that type of stuff. I disliked it because I wasn't invested in the characters and because I found it kind of boring. And part of what made me find it boring is that I don't find fantasy interesting. So again, definitely personal preference there. But yeah, I cared far more about the characters in the movie than I did in the book. And then also the book doesn't bother explaining why Elphaba is afraid of water and like why it hurts her, because we see throughout the book that she doesn't want to be near water. And then there's a part where she's wiping away someone's tears, even though the tears are burning her skin. So we see that water is harmful to her, and yet we don't hear why. Like Gregory Maguire is writing an origin story. This is his opportunity to come up with a reason. Why is water deadly to her? And yet he doesn't. It just kind of is the way it is. But I do like, though, that this book goes all the way up until the witch's death and we see Dorothy arrive in Oz. And again, Dorothy arrives in part 5 of the book. And so that's why I thought that section was more interesting, because that's, when we're getting into the Wizard of Oz story, when Wicked and the Wizard of Oz are starting to overlap. And so I really liked that part. But I will say also in the book, he combines different aspects of the book, The Wizard of Oz, and the movie, because the book and movie are very different. And initially I was frustrated being like, okay, you got to pick one or the other, right? Because they each have different lore, so you can't combine them both. You got to pick one or the other. However, as time went on, I cared less about that, and I was fine with him combining different elements of each. And if anything, I thought it was kind of interesting to see what aspects of the original book he took and what aspects of the movie he adopted, because, yeah, he did a combination of both of them. But yeah, once again, the movie was a delight. I absolutely loved it. Also, Bowen Yang was in this, and I had no idea he was going to be in this movie, but he is like one of my favorite cast members of SNL, so I loved seeing him here in this. And then Jeff Goldblum was perfect as the wizard, and then Michelle Yeoh was Madame Morrible. And she and Jeff Goldblum, it's not like they have these amazing singing voices, and yet their voices worked for their characters, right? And then of course, the main two leads, Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande, their performances were amazing, but also their voices were incredible. I loved the singing so much. Oh, and then also we get a scene with the original 2 cast members from the Broadway version of Wicked. So it was so cool to see them. I haven't even seen the Broadway version of Wicked, and yeah, I still loved seeing them on the screen, and they get a fairly lengthy scene. So yeah, that wraps it up for part 1 of Wicked. For those of you who do not want spoilers, now is the time to click out of the video, because now I'm going to get into certain things that happen in the second half of the book and the second half of the musical. So some interesting things I want to mention from the second half. So in the book, some years pass, and Fahiro, he runs into Elphaba living in Emerald City as she's part of this underground group wanting to take down the wizard. And he is married to that girl he was betrothed to. However, he and Elphaba begin an affair. But then one day she is gone on a mission to again, take down the wizard. And he goes to her home when then guards break in, and when they see Fahiro there, the guards beat Fahiro to death. Whereas in the musical, I read that even though Fahiro is dating Galinda, over time, he eventually does get with Elphaba and the two have a romance. And basically, he becomes the Scarecrow, who is then later with Dorothy. Which is interesting because in the book, when Dorothy and her gang are approaching, the witch sees the Scarecrow, and she's been through a lot at this point, and she's kind of not thinking clearly. And so she's thinking like, oh, the Scarecrow, it must be Fahiro. He's come back. He never died. He's here, and I'm going to be forgiven by him finally. However, again, this was just her delirious thoughts, and it actually wasn't Fahiro. It was just just a regular scarecrow. And then also in the musical, Boq and Nessa, they maintain their relationship even though they are unhappy. And so in the musical, Nessrose turns Boq into the Tin Man. Whereas in the book version of Wicked, the Tin Man, he has the same origin story as he did from the book The Wizard of Oz. And we find out that Nessrose is the one who cursed his axe to cause him to chop off body parts until he became all tin. But I just love in the musical how they make both of these characters people who Elphaba knew. And she kind of knew the Tin Man, right? Because she was there when this woman met with Nessa being like, hey, I don't want my daughter marrying this woodsman. Can you do something about it? So she's there when Nessa curses the axe. So yeah, I thought this was a great change on the part of the musical, and I'm so excited to see it in part 2 of the movie. And then also I wanted to talk about Nessrose a bit more because in both book and movie, the father gives her these very beautiful shoes. And in the book, Glinda ends up putting a spell on the shoes to help Nessrose have balance because due to the fact that she doesn't have arms, balance has always been an issue. However, after this spell is put on her shoes, she's totally all fine. Whereas in the musical, Elphaba is the one who casts the spell on the shoes, and this causes Nessrose to be able to walk. And so I am curious if the movie will keep that the same. I feel like they probably will, but it feels kind of ableist, right? To be like, oh, we have a character in a wheelchair, but don't worry because by the end they're able to walk. So I know that can be kind of not the best sometimes, right? So again, I'm curious if the movie will keep that the same. But then another huge thing that is revealed at the end of both book and musical is that the Wizard of Oz is Elphaba's father. And in the book, Elphaba, this upsets her greatly, of course, because she hates the wizard. However, in the musical, I guess Elphaba never finds this out. But in the book, she does. And of course, it's very distressing to learn. But yeah, of course, there's other stuff that happens in the second half too, but those were the major things I wanted to mention, some of the things that I found the most interesting. So yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. Share your thoughts down below in the comments. And when part 2 of the movie comes out next year, I will be making another video sharing my thoughts. And before I leave, I also want to mention Ana Luisa yet again. Definitely click that link and buy something for yourself or someone else. And thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time. Bye.